The sound of a pen scratching against paper shouldn't feel this loud. But in a house where no one has spoken a real word in years, even a heartbeat feels like a drum. I stared at the line. My name, Ava Reed, was about to be followed by a signature that would end 1,000 days of waiting. 3 years. 1,095 days of being a ghost in my own kitchen, a shadow in my own bed. Liam didn't even look up from his coffee. He never did. He was scrolling through his phone, his face as cold and indifferent as the marble countertops he'd paid for but never sat at with me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, not from fear, but from the sudden sharp realization that I was finally done. I pushed the paper across the table. It slid with a soft hiss. He didn't move. He didn't blink. And that was the moment I knew. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a failed marriage. It's about how I had to die inside just to remember how to breathe. My mother always told me that silence is golden. She was wrong. Silence is a cage. When I married Liam, I thought his quiet nature was strength. I thought his focus on his career was ambition for our future. I was 24, full of light, and deeply in love with a man who looked like a hero from a movie but possessed the emotional depth of a stone. For the first few months, it was manageable. I filled the silence with my laughter, my stories, my dreams. I would cook elaborate dinners, lighting candles and waiting for him to come home, thinking that eventually he'd see me, truly see me. But Liam didn't want a partner. He wanted an ornament, a quiet, beautiful thing to keep his house warm while he built his empire. By the second year, the silence started to rot. It turned from quiet to ignoring. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with someone who looks through you? Not at you, but through you, as if you're a window they're trying to see the weather through. That was my life. I'd ask him how his day was, and he'd give a one-word answer while staring at his laptop. I'd tell him about my day, about the gallery I was trying to manage, about the small joys I found in the world, and he would just nod. No eye contact. No follow-up questions. No, I'm proud of you, Ava. Just the steady, rhythmic tapping of his fingers on a keyboard. It's a special kind of pain, isn't it? To be loved in theory but ignored in reality. I remember one night specifically. It was our 2nd anniversary. I had spent all day preparing. I wore the dress he once said he liked, a deep emerald silk that caught the light. I had booked a table at the place where he proposed. Waited. 7 o'clock turned into 8. It turned into 9. I sat in that restaurant, surrounded by couples whispering and laughing, feeling the weight of every pitying glance from the waiters. When I finally walked through our front door at 10, I found him in his office. He wasn't even working on a crisis. He was just there, reading. He didn't even look up when I walked in, my eyes red and my heart in pieces. "You're late," he said. That was it. No apology. No realization that he had forgotten the one day we were supposed to celebrate us. That night I didn't cry. I think that was the day something inside me just clicked. You can only pour so much water into a cracked cup before you realize it's never going to stay full. I looked at him. His sharp jawline, his expensive watch, the way he occupied space so confidently, and I realized he didn't even know who I was anymore. He didn't know I had stopped painting. He didn't know I had started taking long walks at night just to hear the sound of other people's voices in the park. He didn't know because he never asked. And the worst part, he didn't care that he didn't know. The 3rd year was the hardest. That was when the unjust ice of it all really started to burn. It wasn't just that he was quiet. It was that he made me feel like I was the problem for wanting more. If I complained, he'd call me dramatic. If I cried, he'd walk out of the room. He made me feel like my need for affection, for a simple good morning or a touch on the shoulder, was a burden he shouldn't have to carry. I was being erased piece by piece, day by day. I started to wonder. If I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take for him to notice? A week? A month? Would he just keep scrolling through his phone until the dust on my chair got too thick to ignore? So I stopped. I stopped asking. I stopped cooking. I stopped trying to bridge the gap. I waited for him to notice the change. I waited for him to ask, "Ava, are you okay?" I waited for 3 months in total silence. We lived like roommates who hated each other, except there wasn't even enough passion for hate. There was just nothing. Emptiness. And then, yesterday I found something. Something that didn't just break my heart, it set it on fire. It was a simple receipt, tucked away in his coat pocket. A receipt for a piece of jewelry I had never seen, and a dinner for 2 at a place I wasn't invited to. I stood in the hallway, holding that tiny piece of paper, and I realized that Liam wasn't a man who couldn't speak. He was just a man who chose not to speak to me. The ICE CEO, as his employees called him, had plenty of warmth. He was just giving it to someone else. The betrayal didn't feel like a stab. It felt like a cold splash of water waking me up from a 3-year sleep. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just went to the drawer, pulled out the papers I had hidden there for months, and walked into the kitchen. Now back to that moment. The pen is in my hand. Liam finally looks up from his phone. He sees the papers. He sees the look in my eyes. The look of a woman who has finally found the exit. He scoffs a small, arrogant sound. "You're not serious, Ava," he says, his voice smooth and dismissive. "You have everything here. You wouldn't last a day without me." He thinks he knows me. He thinks I'm still that girl in the emerald dress waiting for a scrap of his time. He has no idea that the woman standing in front of him died months ago, and the one who replaced her is about to burn his world down. I looked him dead in the eye, the first real eye contact we'd had in a year, and I felt a smile touch my lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a dangerous one. "You're right, Liam," I whispered. "I wouldn't last a day as your Ava. That's why she's leaving. But me. I'm just getting started." I signed the paper with a flourish, the ink bleeding into the page. But as I turned to walk away, Liam stood up. For the first time in 3 years, he moved fast. He grabbed my wrist, his grip tighter than it had ever been. "You think it's that easy?" he hissed, his face finally showing a crack of something, anger? Panic. "You think you can just sign a paper and walk away from what I've built?" He leaned in closer, his breath cold against my ear. "You don't know half of what's really going on in this house, Ava. And if you walk out that door, you'll realize that I wasn't the one ignoring you. I was the one protecting you." My heart hammered against my ribs. Protecting me. From what? Before I could answer, the front door, heavy oak door, swung open, and a man I had never seen before, dressed in a dark suit with a look of absolute grimness, stepped inside. He didn't look at Liam. He looked straight at me. "Ms. Reed," he asked, "we need to talk. It's about your father's estate, and why your husband has been spending your inheritance for the last 3 years." The world tilted. I looked at Liam. His face went pale, the arrogance vanished, replaced by a mask of pure terror. The silence was gone, all right, but the noise that was coming was going to be deafening. Here is the continuation of Ava's story. The tension is rising as she discovers that Liam's silence wasn't just coldness. It was a calculated cover for something much darker. The man in the suit introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, a forensic accountant. As he laid a thick folder on the same marble table where I had just signed my life away, the air in the room felt like it was thickening, turning into lead. Liam's hand was still on my wrist, but his grip had gone limp. He looked like a man watching his own execution. "Your father didn't just leave you a legacy, Ms. Reed," Marcus said, his voice as sharp as a razor. "He left you a safety net. A trust fund designed to ensure you never had to rely on anyone. But for the last 3 years, that net has been systematically shredded." I looked at the first page. It was a bank statement. My father had passed away just months before I married Liam. In my grief, I had signed everything Liam put in front of me. Power of attorney, joint access, management rights. I thought I was letting him help me. I thought he was protecting me from the stress of a massive estate while I healed. Instead, I had handed him the keys to my cage. Every month, like clockwork, 6-figure sums had been moved. Not into our joint savings. Not into the house. They were moved into LR Holdings, a shell company I'd never heard of. My hands started to shake. Liam. My voice was a whisper, but it felt like a scream. What is this? He didn't answer. He just stared at the folder. The ICE CEO was finally melting, but it wasn't a pretty sight. It was the sweat of a cornered animal. It's not just the money, Ava, Liam finally croaked, his voice cracking. I was trying to save the company. Your father's firm was failing. I had to use the inheritance to keep the doors open. I did it for us. For us. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a jagged, ugly sound. You ignored me for 3 years to save me? You treated me like a ghost in my own home while you were draining my father's life's work. You didn't even tell me he left me this much. I couldn't, he said, stepping toward me, his eyes wide and desperate. You were too emotional. You wouldn't have understood the business side. That was the final straw. Too emotional. The classic weapon of a man who wants to keep a woman small. I looked at Marcus. How much is left? Marcus didn't blink. Of the original 12 million. Less than 500,000. And most of that is tied up in a property Liam purchased 6 months ago. A property in the Hamptons. Under a different name. My heart stopped. The Hamptons. The receipt I'd found for the jewelry. The dinner for 2. It all clicked. He wasn't saving a company. He was building a second life. A life that didn't include a dramatic wife who asked too many questions. I felt the pain wash away, replaced by a cold, searing focus. The injustice wasn't just the silence. It was the theft of my past and my future. Get out, I said. It was the quietest I had ever spoken, but Liam flinched as if I'd slapped him. Ava, listen. Get out, I roared. The silence of the last 3 years shattered into a million pieces. Take your phone, take your secrets, and get out of my father's house. Because this house, it was his too. And I'm keeping it. The house felt different once Liam was gone. It was still quiet, but it was a clean quiet. For the first week, I didn't leave my bedroom. I sat among the ruins of my marriage, looking at the paintings I had abandoned. I used to paint storms, dark, swirling canvases of gray and violet. Now I felt like I was living inside one. Marcus Thorne became my only link to the outside world. Every day he'd send me another piece of the puzzle. It turned out Liam hadn't just been stealing. He had been lying about my father's death. He had convinced the hospital to let him handle the final arrangements, telling me my father wanted a private, closed casket service because he was disfigured by the illness. I had been so broken I didn't question it. But Marcus found a medical report. My father hadn't died of a long illness. He had died of a sudden heart attack after a heated argument in his office. An argument with his junior partner. An argument with Liam. I stared at the report until the words blurred. The man I had shared a bed with for 3 years hadn't just stolen my money. He might have been the reason my father was dead. The protection he mentioned wasn't for me. It was for himself. He was keeping me quiet, keeping me ignored, so I would never look too closely at the timeline. I went to my father's old study. Liam had kept it locked for years, claiming it was too painful for me to go inside. I broke the lock with a heavy bronze statue Liam had bought me for our first anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me as the wood splintered. Inside, the room smelled like old paper and my father's cedarwood cologne. I started tearing through the drawers. I wasn't looking for money anymore. I was looking for the truth. Hidden behind a false bottom in his desk, I found a leather-bound journal. The last entry was dated the day he died. Liam is pushing too hard. He thinks I don't see what he's doing with the offshore accounts. I made a mistake bringing him into the family. Tomorrow I tell Ava. She needs to know the man she's marrying isn't who he pretends to be. I just hope I'm not too late. He was too late. By a few hours. I fell to my knees, clutching the journal to my chest. The betrayal was so deep it felt like it was in my marrow. Liam had watched me mourn. He had held me while I cried for a father he knew he had pushed to the brink. He had looked into my eyes every morning, knowing he was the reason I was an orphan. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. The pale, hollowed-out girl was gone. In her place stood someone I didn't recognize. Someone with a debt to settle. Revenge is a word people use when they want to sound dramatic. I prefer the word restoration. I spent the next month working with Marcus to track every cent Liam had moved. We found the woman, the one the jewelry was for. Her name was Chloe. She was 22, a flighty social climber who thought she had landed a millionaire. She had no idea the millionaire was living on a stolen inheritance that was about to run dry. I didn't go to the police yet. Liam was smart. He had covered his tracks with legal loopholes. If I wanted him to suffer, I had to play his game. I had to use the silence he had taught me. She was exactly what I expected. Shiny, vapid, and wearing the necklace that should have been bought with my money. "My boyfriend is so generous," she chirped, sipping her wine. "He's buying me this beautiful estate. He says he wants to move there full-time once he settles some business in the city." "He sounds lovely," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "But tell me, Chloe, does he ever talk about his wife?" The color drained from her face. "His what?" "His wife, Ava." I leaned in, the raw power of the truth vibrating between us. "The one whose father he robbed. The one whose life he tried to erase. I'm her." I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. But I wasn't there to hurt her. She was just another pawn Liam had used. "I'm not here to fight over him, Chloe. I'm here to give you a choice. You can keep the necklace and wait for the police to seize that estate next week. Or you can help me make sure he never does this to anyone again." By the end of the lunch, I had her phone. And on that phone were 3 years' worth of texts from Liam. Texts detailing his plans to leave me, his contempt for my weakness, and most importantly, his admission that he had handled my father's intervention. The trap was set. All I needed was the bait. I invited Liam back to the house. I told him I wanted to discuss a settlement, that I was tired of the fighting and just wanted to move on. He came over that evening looking smug. He thought he'd won. He thought I had finally broken. He walked into the living room wearing a tailored suit, looking every bit the successful mogul. "I knew you'd be reasonable, Ava," he said, pouring himself a drink as if he still owned the place. "We can make this go away quietly. No lawyers, no scandal. Just a clean break." "Quietly," I repeated. "You always did love the quiet, Liam." I stood by the fireplace, watching the flames. "Before we sign anything, I want you to see something." I started painting again. I turned around a large canvas that had been covered with a cloth. It wasn't a storm. It was a portrait. A photorealistic painting of my father. His eyes stern and knowing, staring directly at where Liam was sitting. Liam froze. The glass in his hand trembled. "He knew, Liam," I said, my voice echoing in the vast room. "He knew about the accounts. He knew about the lies. And he wrote it all down." I pulled the journal from my bag. "The police are outside, Liam. And Marcus is at the DA's office right now with your shell company's tax records. But before they take you, I wanted you to know one thing." I walked up to him, stopping just inches from his face. I was no longer the girl who was ignored. I was the one who held all the light. "You thought you were erasing me," I whispered. "But all you did was give me the time to study you. I know every lie you tell. I know the sound of your fear. And for the rest of your life, in a small gray cell, you're going to have all the silence you ever wanted." The arrogance finally shattered. He dropped the glass, and it exploded on the marble floor. The same sound the pen had made, but louder. Final. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Liam sank into the chair, defeated. He looked small. For 3 years I had thought he was a giant. But he was just a thief standing in a dead man's shoes. I walked out of the house and into the cool night air. I didn't look back. The injustice was over. The transformation had begun. I wasn't just Ava Reed, the widow or the divorcee. I was the woman who had survived the silence. The trial didn't start with a bang. It started with a suffocating silence that felt all too familiar. I sat in that courtroom, my back straight, wearing a suit the color of a storm cloud. Across the room sat Liam. He looked different without his expensive watches and the lighting of his high-rise office. He looked smaller, but his eyes, they were still cold. They still tried to look through me as if I were a window. But I wasn't a window anymore. I was a mirror, reflecting every ugly truth he had ever tried to hide. The prosecutor began to lay out the evidence, and for the first time, I heard the mechanical details of my own erasure. It wasn't just that he ignored me. He had built a glass cage around my life. Marcus Thorne took the stand and revealed that Liam had set up filters on my email and my phone. Any message from my father's old associates, any notification from the bank about my trust fund, any legal alert regarding the estate, they were all diverted. I wasn't just being ignored by a husband. I was being intercepted by a warden. I watched the jury's faces as Marcus showed the digital trail. Liam had been masquerading as me for years, replying to emails in my name, telling my friends I was going through a rough patch and needed space. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my reputation. He had isolated me so thoroughly that when I finally felt lonely, I thought it was my fault. I felt a sick heat rise in my chest. The injustice was so much deeper than a few $1,000,000. It was the calculated theft of my identity. But the most brutal blow came when the forensic team presented Liam's browser history from the month my father died. He hadn't just been looking at offshore accounts. He had been researching signs of a silent heart attack and response times for emergency services in the suburbs. He knew my father was at risk. He knew what a high-stress argument would do to a man with a weak heart. And he had walked into that office that day with a plan to trigger the very thing that would leave me an orphan and him a king. When it was my turn to take the stand, the room felt like it had run out of oxygen. Liam's lawyer, a man with a smile like a shark, stood up to cross-examine me. He didn't ask about the money. He went for the jugular, my mental state. "Ms. Reed," he began, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "you claim you were ignored for 3 years. But isn't it true that you suffered from severe depression after your father's death? Isn't it true that my client was simply giving you the space you seemed to crave?" He held up a medical record from a therapist I had seen briefly in the first year of my marriage. A therapist Liam had chosen for me. "You told this doctor you felt invisible, didn't you? Perhaps you weren't being ignored, Ava. Perhaps you were just hiding." I looked at Liam. He had a faint, smug smile on his lips. He thought he could gaslight me one last time, even in a court of law. He thought he could use my grief as a weapon against my sanity. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of old wood and tension. "I was hiding," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I was hiding because the man I loved made me feel like my voice was a nuisance. I was hiding because every time I tried to stand up, he pulled the floor out from under me." I leaned forward, looking directly at the jury. He didn't give me space. He gave me a void. He watched me drown in my own sorrow and used the splashes to fuel. The smug smile slid off Liam's face. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He realized that the weak, emotional girl was gone. The woman standing on that witness stand was a fire he couldn't put out with silence. The defense tried to pivot, but the damage was done. I wasn't a victim of depression. I was a survivor of a psychological siege. The jury was out for 3 days. Those 72 hours felt longer than the 3 years I had spent married to him. I spent the time in my father's study, surrounded by the smell of old books and cedar. I didn't paint. I didn't work. I just sat in the stillness, learning to be okay with my own company. I realized that the silence I had feared for so long was actually a gift, if I was the one controlling it. When the call finally came, my heart didn't race. Settled. I walked back into that courtroom and stood as the foreman read the words. Guilty on all counts. Fraud. Identity theft. Embezzlement. And while they couldn't charge him with my father's death directly, The judge noted the extraordinary cruelty of his actions during the sentencing. Liam was sentenced to 15 years. As the bailiffs moved in to take him away, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He spoke to me. "You think you've won, Ava?" he hissed as they led him past my chair. "You're still the girl who can't even eat a meal alone without crying. You'll be back in that empty house and you'll realize I was the only thing making you relevant." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just watched him go. That was his final trick, trying to make me believe I was nothing without his shadow. But as the heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was carrying. The house wasn't empty when I got home that night. It was full of possibility. I walked into the kitchen, the same marble kitchen where I had signed those papers, and I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the table. I looked at the empty chair across from me. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel lonely. Felt free. But the freedom came with a price. As I reached for my phone to call Marcus, a notification popped up. An unknown number had sent me a video file. Click play. It was a grainy security feed from my father's office, dated the day he died. A feed Liam thought he had deleted. And in that video, Liam wasn't just arguing with my father. He was holding something. A small orange pill bottle. My father's heart medication. And he was standing just out of reach as my father gasped for air, clutching his chest. The trial was over, but the true horror was only just beginning. The video played again, and again. Each time, the grainy pixels felt like they were burning into my retinas. My father slumped over his mahogany desk, his hand outstretched, trembling. And Liam, standing there with the orange pill bottle just out of reach. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't hitting him. He was just watching, waiting for the silence to become permanent. I felt a coldness settle over me that no fireplace could touch. The trial had put him away for money, for fraud, for the clean crimes. But this was murder by omission. I looked at the sender's number. It was encrypted. "A friend of the truth," the message read. I realized then that while Liam was behind bars, the web he had spun was still vibrating. Someone else had been watching him. Someone else had held this footage for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to strike. I called Marcus at 3 in the morning. "I need you to look at a file," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "And Marcus, don't tell the police. Not yet. If I handed this to the authorities now, Liam's high-priced lawyers would argue it was tampered with or that it didn't prove intent. No, if I wanted him to pay for my father's life, I had to find out who sent this and why they waited so long." I went back to the office, the building that now bore my family name again. I didn't go to my executive floor. I went to the server room in the basement. I needed to know if this footage was pulled from our own internal systems or if someone had planted a hidden camera. As I scrolled through the old logs, I found something that made my heart stop. The camera that captured this wasn't part of the security system. It was a webcam. A webcam on my father's own laptop. Someone had hacked into his computer the day he died. Someone had been ghosting his screen. And that person hadn't just watched him die. They had recorded it as leverage. I wasn't just fighting Liam anymore. I was walking into a nest of vipers that Liam had brought into our lives. The encrypted messages continued. "Meet me at the pier. 11 p.m. Come alone or the video vanishes." Felt like a scene from a bad thriller, but this was my life. I drove out to the old harbor, the smell of salt and rot filling the car. A figure stood in the shadows of a warehouse. Chloe. The shiny, vapid girl from the Hamptons was gone. She looked hollow, her eyes darting around like she expected a bullet to find her at any moment. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Liam told me he had a failsafe. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I should send that video to you to negotiate his release. But I saw it, Ava. I saw what he did." She handed me a small USB drive. "There's more on there. He wasn't just stealing from you. He was laundering money for a group in Eastern Europe. That's why he was so desperate. That's why he couldn't let your father go to the board. He was scared. He's still scared. Suddenly, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. Chloe screamed and ran into the shadows. I stood my ground, the USB drive clenched in my fist. A black sedan pulled up, and two men stepped out. They didn't look like Liam's friends. They looked like the reason Liam didn't sleep at night. "Ms. Reed," one of them said, his voice a low growl. "You have something that belongs to our business interests. Liam's debt didn't vanish when he went to prison. It transferred to the estate. It transferred to you." The injustice hit me with a new, terrifying weight. Liam hadn't just ruined our past. He had mortgaged our future to people who didn't care about courtrooms or verdicts. They wanted the $12 million my father had left me. And they were willing to tear down everything I had rebuilt to get it. I didn't run. For 3 years I had been the victim. I had been the girl who was ignored, the wife who was robbed, the daughter who was orphaned. I was tired of being the prey. "The money is gone," I said, my voice echoing off the corrugated metal of the warehouse. "Liam spent it. But I have something better than money. I have evidence that links your organization to 3 years of international wire fraud through Liam's shell companies. If anything happens to me or to Chloe, that drive goes to the FBI. And believe me, they've been looking for a reason to shut you down." It was a bluff. I didn't even know what was on the second drive yet. But in that moment, I channeled every bit of the cold, calculating ICE CEO energy that Liam had used to suppress me. I used his own weapons against the world he had created. The men exchanged. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ava," the leader said, stepping closer. "I've been playing a dangerous game for 3 years," I replied, staring him down. "I just didn't know the rules until now. You have 24 hours to leave this city. If I see a black sedan near my house or my office again, the FBI gets a very interesting gift. Go tell your bosses that Liam Reed is a dead end. And so am I." They lingered for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut. Then, without a word, they got back into the car and vanished into the night. I leaned against my car, my lungs finally burning for air. I had won the standoff, but I knew this wasn't over. I had to finish Liam once and for all. Not for the money. Not for the silence. But for the orange pill bottle. I visited the prison the next day. I didn't want a settlement. I didn't want an apology. I sat behind the plexiglass and waited for Liam to be let in. He looked terrible, beaten down by the reality of a life without luxury. "You came to gloat," he spat, his voice raspy. I didn't speak. I simply held up a printed still frame from the video. The moment he held the pills, the color left his face so fast I thought he might faint. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that I've already sent a copy to the district attorney. They're opening a new case, Liam. Second-degree murder. You thought 15 years was a long time. You're never coming out. You're going to grow old in a cage, and the only thing you'll have to listen to is the sound of your own heart beating. Just like my father did." He started to scream, a primal, ugly sound, pounding his fists against the glass. But I had already stood up. I walked away as the guards tackled him to the floor. The noise didn't bother me. It was just background noise to the peace I was finally feeling. I went to my father's grave that afternoon. I laid a single emerald-colored flower on the stone, the color of the dress I wore the night I realized my marriage was dead. "It's done, Dad," I whispered. "The house is quiet, but it's a good quiet now. People ask me how I survived it. They ask how I moved from being ignored to being the woman who runs an empire. The answer is simple. I stopped waiting for someone else to tell me I existed. Injustice thrives in the dark. It grows in the ignore. It feeds on your silence and your hope that things will just get better. But things don't get better, you make them better. I learned that my value wasn't tied to a man who couldn't see me. My value was in the strength it took to sign that paper, the courage to look at the grainy video, and the power to stand on a pier in the middle of the night and say, "No more." If you're listening to this and you feel invisible, if you feel like your partner is a wall you can't climb, know this: you are not a ghost. You are the lead character in your own story. And sometimes, the only way to get your happy ending is to write the villain out of the script yourself. Ava Reed. I was married for 3 years to a man who ignored me. Today, I've never felt more seen. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you've lived through something similar, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.